Those who refuse to learn history and those who are willing to learn history are equally bound to repeat it. The current exhibit at SCI-Arc displays work produced by a small group of architects in Los Angeles in 1979. So what's the conceptual time frame for the exhibit? 1979 scene from 2013, 1979 scene from 1979. The way we are, looking at the way we were looking at the way we are, contingent on the way we were. If the SCI-Arc Architecture Exhibition in 1979 was a small group's private speculations on the future prospects of architecture, what's the meaning of an exhibit of that work 35 years later, pointed at a very public constituency? Does the current exhibition indicate that the intention of the original exhibitors who once disowned the pedigrees of others to now affirm their own? Henry Kissinger, that well-known architect, on a visit to Beijing, roughly at the time of the original SCI-Arc exhibition, is supposed to have asked Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, what do you think about the French Revolution? And Zhou is supposed to have answered, I don't know. Not enough time has passed yet. Current explanations of the 2013 redo of the 1979 exhibit are loaded with similar caveats. For instance, we're simply making the work available to the public, or we put it out there and you decide, or the intention is not to determine ultimate meanings, or meanings vary over time, or the Zhou Enlai safety net, maybe not enough time has passed yet, and so on. Zhou asked Kissinger for more time. We shouldn't. Let's determine what the 1979 exhibition meant for architecture in Los Angeles. The psychoanalyst Carl Jung divided humanity into two groups, the introverts, and the extroverts. The extrovert determines his life's work by referencing and responding to the preferences and priorities of the world outside himself. The extrovert is a respondent. The introvert determines his life's work by describing the characteristics of the world he discovers and explores within himself. The introvert looks inside and tells the world his own story. According to Miguel de Cervantes, there once was a famous Spanish knight named Don Quixote. His squire was the equally ubiquitous Sancho Panza. You all know of their famous adventure with the windmill giants. What you may not know is how it ended. 500 years after Cervantes' open-ended narrative, the 1979 SCI-Arc Architecture Exhibition wrote the conclusion to that Don Quixote adventure. Sancho, the quintessential extrovert, saw only windmills. The villagers agreed. They still do. The Don, forever the introvert, saw only his giants. No one agreed. They still don't. The extroverts insisted that the Don was a dreamer, his life story a fantasy, but the Don wasn't listening. He still doesn't. The Don attacked his giants, and the battle was on, and the battle endures. So who was correct? the introverted Don or the extroverted Sancho. The consensus was with Sancho, but Cervantes left the question unresolved until that small group of Los Angeles architects delivered architecture's unequivocal and enduring answer to Cervantes' ultimate question in their 1979 exhibition. That enduring voice resonating from the 1979 exhibitors is this: the enemy is not your windmills. The enemy is our giants. No caveats. Zhou Enlai was wrong. No additional contemplation time is required. And if you listen very carefully, you can still hear the clatter of Don Quixote's lance as it collides with his giant adversary.
Hello, I'm here actually to introduce Coy Howard, who is going to who has made up a piece that is going to speak about the show 35 years after his first conclusion. And what I wanted to do is very simply kind of clarify kind of how it came about and provide a context to what was taking place at this particular time. A lot of us could be quite parallel to what came up in the roundtable an hour and a half ago. I was just talking to several young people here, and we were discussing the huge difference in the context that was taking place today and was taking place in 1979. And I had been on a sabbatical, and I'd just come back from Harvard, and was just completely overtaken with being back in the Los Angeles environment, and found myself in some ways quite out of place in the Boston, a particular type of pedagogy which wasn't totally suitable to my thinking. And it was, SARC was not yet institutionalized. It was a very, very simple place. And the faculty meetings were at Ray Cappy's house, and it was fairly loose. And somehow I found out very quickly after returning that it was my turn to put together the lecture series. And half an hour, sat down and wrote down 9 names, 11 people. And there was essentially a loose connection, some more than others. All of them came through our connection through teaching, primarily UCLA and this place. And they were all imports. Well, all except 3. I just this morning kind of looked at this, and I kind of knew this, but didn't know where. 3 of them are from LA, 2 from San Francisco, Oakland, 1 from Texas, Coy, 2 Ohio, 1 Maryland, 1 Canada, and 1 Romania. They went to East Coast schools primarily, 3 of them Harvard, 3 of them Yale, Washington University, and then Berkeley and UCLA, another 3. And so it was a diverse group of people in terms of their educational backgrounds. And they were part, again, of maybe at the end of a generation where it would be most common that majority of people in Los Angeles came from someplace else. I had just gotten the studio in Venice, and again, we were joking about the difference in LA. I'm 2 blocks from the beach. I had a space just a little smaller than this for $400, And life was quite simple. And I think we got paid maybe $1,100 or something a month, but $400 rent, you have a Volkswagen, and you lived a lovely life. And it just somehow occurred spontaneously that it seemed like kind of an interesting idea to have, not to curate, to make available this space parallel to the lecture series. And in fact, completely leaving these people to their own devices, where each one of them chose the nature of how they wanted to talk about their involvement in architecture. And that was part of the idea. And parallel to that, again, quite by coincidence, at the first show, a guy named Richard Dreyfuss, who was writing at the time for the LA Times, the architectural critic, talked to me and came to the first show, which was Eugene's, and got interested in it and published a actually front page calendar article. And then right after that came back to me and was very proactive in writing a series of articles on all the shows. And it was absolutely, again, a total coincidence. And it came from him. And it ended up being extremely potent in that it might have been the first time that there was a consistent series of articles, front page, every week. And then what happened is the Eugene, we got maybe 5 or 6 people every day, and in this little studio, and then weekend it ramped up to a couple dozen. And the second one, it ramped up hugely. By the third one, I had these enormous crowds and I had to go out and hire people to run the show. And it was just really, really fascinating. And part of it was Frank Gehry's first show, by the way. It was kind of really interesting. And it became kind of an event. I've read, or people have talked to me about blogs about certain notions of self-promotion of this group, or et cetera, and I have to say it's absolutely absurd. It was done in the most naive sense. And if anything, as we discuss maybe some of the connective tissue of this group, this is not a group that is very sophisticated in self-promotion. They were heavily involved in their investigations, completely sans any type of reality or engagement with the real world. And it's, again, it's funny, I don't like looking, this is weird for me. I never look back. I actually detest going back, and it's just, I'm in my own world, but here I am. But looking back, I have to say it's really odd how immensely detached this group of people were and how unstrategic they were, how they just weren't interested or very good at that promotion. And it was actually, in my assessment, quite naive at that level, and only Frank had that, and he's 15 years older, and it was much more sophisticated in understanding his relationship to commerce, and of course he came through a more traditional practice. The first thing, and we touched on it in the roundtable, and this is now for the students here, not for anybody else. You couldn't escape a context, and I would claim in different ways it had to have an effect on all of us. There was this huge amount of, there were things happening around us at this particular time, starting in the mid-60s, that would have to have something to do with the formation of who we are and the values and the essences of what we support that becomes absolutely rooted to our interest in architecture. And a lot of us woke up looking at our number in terms of our potential of being drafted into the war. And then, of course, culturally, it was an explosion. And you were there, you were at these events, and to this day, it has an incredible power in terms of the degree of expression, the notion of having a voice, and what that means in a very, very tangible way. And to this day, Wolf Pricks wants to be this guy. And we can talk about it. I can guarantee you, Wolf wants to be Keith Richards, and admires that he's a person that could be so insanely stoned that he couldn't function in any characteristic until you put a guitar in front of him, and then he's a genius. And it was inescapable if you were part of this world at this time. The intensity of the human capacity to to conceptualize and to realize an artistic intention. And then with this were all types of, everywhere around us. The norm was rooted in interrogation, investigation, experimentation, all of it looking at our cultural, political world, and it was embedded in film. And I can't imagine I'm the only one in this group that hasn't been hugely influenced. I would have actually, if I had to say influences, I would say this is probably more powerful than architecture, that it was what really formed me at the time, and it determined what I wanted to be as an architect. And it was quite different. These were, again, you guys can tell me, these weren't art films. These were films. This is what you did, right? And all your friends saw these films. And it was just what was taking place. And go back and relook at Weekend. And look at what Godard was doing, and it's just, it'd be impossible to have that film today. It would be such an extreme, right? It would be in some art house that 15 people could look at. And then there's, of course, the Antonionis, trained as an architect. He spray painted the park green, right? And we could go through a huge amount of stuff. This amazing, amazing character. And this was our context, and of course, the Truffauts, et cetera. Well, I'm just showing little bits and pieces, and then right in our backyard, most of us, or a large number of us, lived in Venice, environ, et cetera. And LA, of course, was exploding, and you might say kind of taking over the whole art scene vis-a-vis New York. And these are part of the norm. And here we are in Market Street with Robert Irwin's Scrim. And of course, Doug Christmas is occupying these spaces that he doesn't own and kind of overtaking them. It's his own fantastic, hilarious story. And this is an owner, a vacant, right, owner, that he just takes the store, empties it, takes down the thing and puts the Scrim up. And when the guy comes back and finds out it's his, he takes it down. And then here we are right down the street. And this is 10 years later, we're doing a little project at Market Street, 72, a restaurant, and this is the site we had. And of course, this is Heiser, and it's one of his first shows. Again, Doug Christmas was there. And then again, it continues, and in every place, actually, Ginsberg even was hanging out at SC, believe it or not. And here we were, and I'm in my young 20s, or just 20, and this is the world that was every day. And there were social things happening which were profound. This was something you tucked under your shoulder when I was a sophomore, maybe, in undergraduate school at UC. And somebody that I had the greatest admiration for, which the FBI was looking for. And you couldn't subtract that from your own desires of how you wanted to interact with the world, and how somehow architecture has a place and an engagement within a social, cultural, political context.
I have a dream that one day
there were historic things taking place which were changing the face of our country. And they had an optimism, and they were followed by deep, huge, sorrowful times. And again, I have no idea. These are complex notions, and they affect all of us in radically different ways. And they would certainly affect some dynamic of a certain type of energy that comes from a certain optimism vis-a-vis the reverse, something that's critical or pessimistic, and it's some sort of a balance of those. And the Rotz Wyatts, I'm living right around the corner at SC when this is taking place, and you're part of it. And of course, again, we could go on and on with huge numbers of changes taking place within the culture of this country, having to do with the gender, and again.
And so, my fellow Americans.
And again, living and being aware of being part of one of the more violent countries in the world, and the profound effect that has on your being and your sense of the social obligations, the connection of architecture in terms of its position in the world. And then there's a whole other discussion, and it came up a bit today in our roundtable. We were all at different levels. It would be impossible, Gene, to be unaware of the tradition that we are following. And of course, it starts with Schindler and Neutra, and it actually starts in that you were giving dates. I would say it's 1914 in Vienna when Lohse is talking to Schindler and saying, get out of town and show up in L.A. He shows up in Taliesin with Reich, shows up in L.A. to build the Barnes house as the young guy on the site, and the rest is history. And then we show up, and it's House 22 by Pierre Koenig, who was my second-year teacher at SC, and it's Craig Elwood, who was my fifth-year teacher at SC, and who, by the way, was bringing out Mies van der Rohe, et cetera, that would come out at every 3 or 4 months, and we had no clue who he was. It was a bizarre history of the time in terms of history. It was amazing, the disconnection we had at this particular time in the school. And then it goes on with the Sarianos, who was part of the review process, and then Cappy, who was maybe the youngest of the group, again, was a fifth-year teacher of mine, and was very much rooted in this group. And then the story gets a little more complicated, and it's beyond maybe the notion of this introduction. But there's a series of changes that are taking place as there's a beginning of an idea of the exhaustion of the modern project. We're on third generation, and we could look at various consolidations of that idea. Complexity and contradiction, if you read the first 6 pages and threw everything else away, there was going in a very kind of orthodox historic position. Started a set of ideas which were profound and which were moving from into hybridization and a form of complexity that, again, I would claim all of us had certain roots in that thinking, and it was inescapable in terms of this particular document, and it was starting to produce fissures in the city of which the beginning of the school was part of, because Ray, being the instigator of the 6 of us that started the school, was definitely part of this regime. And it's a very kind of complicated story, but he was still rooted within the tradition of the people I'm talking about, and was at the same time open enough to engage in a tolerance or a conversation for the next generation, all of which were included in this show. And then in the background, and Jeffrey or somebody else can pick this up, there was absolute a knowledge of connections of groups of people, the New York Five, of course, and there was all of us, I guess, had different connections, and then there's huge numbers of other influences. The Leo Castelli show, I'd have to ask these guys how many people were there. That's where I learned who Pickler was, Raymond Abraham, et cetera, et cetera. And we're starting to move around a bit. And then, of course, there's a series of characters that had huge interest, and now we can name different people, and I'm using Hans Rucker, and of course, Sid Price, and the Super Studio Boys, Natalini, et cetera. And there's the emergence of a series of new ideas which most of us are certainly aware of and have some effect on our own trajectory. And then, of course, there's, I think, what you would have to say is one of the key events. There's the development of 2 schools. There's, I mean, up to this time, USC had been the singular school, and it represented a very powerful tradition, which, again, everybody here knows, but as students, it represented a coherency, let's say, which was would be part of this case study boys, because the case study group, you could say, institutionalized the Neutra and the Schindler and the Wright to some degree, right? And they had a program, if you go back to the House 22, that Pierre Koenig had a very clear idea of the nature of the building in technological terms and environmental terms, in terms of its relationship to inside, outside, in terms of social condition, the rethinking of the domestic environment, including gender, et cetera, and it was a coherent program. And after that, that's going to break away. And so UCLA shows up, and the Archogram boys come with it, and here they are with their inflatables, and it's going to take off now. It's 1968. They're going to Osaka and Cape Canaveral, it was called at the time. And then right behind that is SCI-Arc in 1972. And it's quickly forming. Michael's not here. If you look at that upper photograph, that's Michael Rotundi. We brought 40 students from Pomona. And it was kind of amazing that it even made it. And then very quickly, by happenstance, I have no idea, there was just an energy here. And so here we are in '73, and Craig is lecturing, and then right after that, again, you look at the people, and we're looking at Roland Cote, who's here, and Paul Kennan, and Caesar Pelli, and Frank Gehry are lecturing, and then right after that, Tschumi, Mangurian, Liebskin, Vito Conci, Raymond Abraham, and it's quickly becoming a hub, a magnet for the discourse of architecture, and it's hugely important. And of course, this is parallel to UCLA. And then with that, there's Charlie Jenks just showing up, and there's other kind of things going on, and it's becoming a place of engagement. Everything is part of a project. These are posters. These are posters by Coy Howard, and literally everything that was part of the production of these was part of the work of the people there. And then I didn't put these together in order, and we had a short discussion earlier. I think there were a series of connections, and they were by no means any type of coherent program or agenda of architecture. That it seems as though each of us had a quite autonomous idea of how we were going to change architecture, or how we were going to engage in architecture, and in terms of our own investigations. But I would have said we shared a notion of autonomy, I would say even outsiderness, that was clearly connected. There was a shared notion of thinking and exploring through drawings and objects, and it was pervasive in the group. And there was a connection in making. It came up a little bit this afternoon. All of us were very, very engaged in the potential of invention that comes out of the engagement of making process and the materiality, et cetera, out of that. And I think as you look at the work, Roland Cote, who is becoming a painter, that you see this continuously in terms of the way each of these people decides to communicate their ideas, and they're very, that's Frank, believe it or not, they're very detached from any literalness of architectural drawings that are connected to, what is it, plan, section, elevation, the making of a building in a mechanical sense. And they're somehow tangent, parallel. They have a quasi-autonomy in terms of their own presence, as well as connecting to the future work. And then it probably becomes clear as you look back that there seems to be quite a difference in the status of these different people in terms of where they were going to become in 10 years or 20 years, in terms of how far along they were in terms of their own formation. And I find it quite interesting now looking back, because I would say that Frank is just about fully formed, and that you can see all the DNA matter in this work, that you could see all the way through his current work. And there's going to be connections between people, which in itself interesting. And Peter, I didn't ask you today, I think Michael's working for you on this project while we're working together. and I'm using Frank Lupo coming out of Robert Mangarian, and there's these series of connections, and it's bringing stuff. Absolutely. It's coming with information, right? It's a conduit between various people. And it was well known. And we filled our time with just engaging in activities of rethinking how one produces the construction of a building in this case. And then, I came across this, and again, I haven't asked anybody permission, but Craig, I'm going to claim I know his connection with Yale and James Sterling, and I'm looking at this and go, oh, Sterling shows up via Craig, via Yale, and it's clear in the notion, and there's going to be this series of connections which is extreme and hugely diverse. That's part of this group, which I think is extremely important, that it doesn't follow a singular orthodoxy, and that the lack of that orthodoxy or that singularity of the rules by which architecture is made, which quickly becomes, it turns into prohibitions, is part of the connective tissue that's part of experiment and interrogation, etc. And again, it's fascinating to look at this work and to look at it 35 years from now and to look at the information that still exists with each of these people in their current practice. And I'll speak for myself. There's no question that bits and pieces of these, some very profound, had a huge amount to do with my own development as an architect, my own learning as an architect. The edge condition of this drawing, the fragmented condition, its position on the paper, the lower horizontal line, every piece of this, I was absolutely clear, and it did not escape me in terms of however it found its way into my own work. And then the draws, these pieces of Koi's, again, were the tangency to the work, their autonomy in terms of what they talk about and how they discuss architecture was just incredibly important. And I think it's actually quite unique still that in this group of people. And then, well, Koi's a guy that knows art. And so here we are with Duchamp and Dust Breeders, and it's actually it's a Man Ray photograph of the large glass that was left out with dust. And okay, the references are clear, right? We understand that. And his interest in contingency, his interest in found condition is absolutely evident in the work. And his expansion of the conversation of how we locate our work is absolutely profound. With that, I introduce Koi Howard.
Hello? Hello? Hello, who is this?
Dylan started it. He sang Ballad of a Thin Man. Someone mumbled, "Go west, young man." Weeks passed, 10. Mumbling again, Terry Allen ended it with the art mob. Somewhere between mumblings, 10 guys, some soloists, others duets, placed their bets. And then, no password, just a look, boarded the train, each picking carefully which car, which seat, avoiding others or getting close enough to hear. Whispered confidences, insecurities, bravado, sounding the same, squeaky, young. Voices change, white hats, black hats, circus performers, cowboys, stowaway tramps, wannabe princes, and sometimes sorcerers. Traveling, go west, young man, through Burma-shaved towns, seeing what counts and what doesn't, what lasts and what shouldn't, from ice cream stick forts to tuned carburetors, hijacking history. Truth traveling in the shadow, first one side, then the other. The train snakes the terrain, rocking like a cradle, climbing for the high chair. Two fathers, the ringmaster and the engineer, stoking every log a longing. This engine can't break. Hex signs, voodoo symbols, biblical curses, revival tents, and secret handshakes everywhere, traveling to places with no names, peeking through keyhole tunnels, flickering lights, Plato shadows, looking for clues for crimes to commit. Waystation dogs chasing their tails, speechifying, angel finger drawings, Dr. Caligari visions. Not footprints, just breadcrumbs. Desires don't explain, they just draw lines to see who might step across, strutting rock stars or just waiters, waiting to be legends, assaulting, seducing. Some riding the train like a horse, the Pony Express from there to here. Changing cars, sensitivities hidden in their eccentricities, habits more than visions, those mannerisms and quirks, sometimes with and then against a timeless changing world. The weirdness of the ordinary, the wealth of the vernacular. More black shantytown than Parisian palace. Whitman wails, Ginsberg howls. I could have been a contender, challenged to a duel. Cards are played. Poker-faced bluffs are called. Traveling, go west, young man. Tracks fork, trains change. Snakes lose their skin. Guardians and gatekeepers, the demons of discarded logics, proselytizing in the aisles. But this engine won't break. Go west, young man, every log a longing. This engine roars, back alleys and junkyards, celebrating a world, unfinished, echoing east through white silences of old traditions, traveling to unmapped corners of the psyche, seeing only reflections, themselves and phantom towns, rising, fading, mutely, echoing, like a racing rumor, way out ahead, no need to dress, echoing, echoing. This engine roars.